Great, thanks. And let's move directly into the first. We have a series of 3 plenary sessions this morning, and the first one is obviously, as in the tradition of IMC, related to IPCC. So I think Keywan and Detlef are chairing the session, please.
Okay, great. So, in the very first session, we would like to specifically go into the role of scenarios and integrated assessment modelings for the IPCC AR7. And you probably all have noticed that the new cycle for IPCC has just started, and there's a new bureau, and the elections last summer have been I think very interesting for us. Jim SKEA was elected as IPCC chair. Kate Calvin, actually from our own community, is co-chair now of IPCC Working Group 3. So in this session, we have decided that we would like to have the first 25 minutes devoted specifically to the IPCC, and we will ask Jim and Kate to indicate their expectations for this round of IPCC, and specifically how we as integrated assessment modeling community could contribute to that. And after that, the next 25 minutes, we would like to discuss the progress on community scenario work. And so, having said that, I would like to give the floor to Jim SKEA and Kate Calvin. They are joining us from Geneva. There is actually an IPCC Bureau meeting happening at this time, and so hopefully they are online. So maybe in the back you could help us bringing in Kate and Jim. So the first speaker that I would like to introduce is indeed Jim SKEA. Jim SKEA is a professor of renewable energy at Imperial College, and obviously the new chair of IPCC. We have slides from Jim, so they are available at the back. So I hope you can share them as well. And the floor is yours, Jim. Yours, Jim. We can't hear you yet.
Okay, thank you. You weren't allowing me to unmute myself, Detlef. That was the issue. And I also need to get screen sharing if I'm going to use my slides. But let me just get started while that gets sorted out, and just say thank you for this big opportunity to talk at this session of the IEMC annual meeting in my new role as IPCC chair. And just to say, it will be the best IEMC meeting ever. So I am very happy to be there. Now, I'm very pleased to say that many familiar colleagues like Kate are part of the scientific leadership for AR7. And also I'd note Jan Fuglesvedt is also a vice chair in Working Group 3, and he acted as a bridge between Working Group 1 and the IEM community in Working Group 3 in the last cycle. And just to say, I mean, Detlef has hinted at it, Working Group 3 has a clear fingerprint all over the 7th cycle. 3 of the 4 most senior roles, the chair and the vice chairs, come from the AR6 Working Group 3 Bureau. That's myself, Diana Urgevorsets, and Ramon Pix Madruga from Cuba. So the IEM community is clearly vital for climate science efforts. 2 leading members of the community are in the top 5 of the Reuters hot list of the world's top climate scientists. Just to say, coincidentally, these 2 individuals are also on the coming panel, and many are in the top 100. Now, one of the things I recall right at the start of the IPCC 6th cycle in 2016, there was a modelers meeting at College Park, Maryland. The Paris Agreement had just been reached, and the IPCC panel had decided to accept the UNFCCC invitation to produce a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And an IPCC government focal point who attended the meeting, known to many of you, observed that the integrated assessment modelling community was about to have its place in the sun, given the unique perspective it had on the 1.5 challenge. And of course, this has certainly proved to be the case. IEM findings were central to the 1.5 report, which came out in 2018, and of course the Working Group 3 report, which arrived a few years later. And the 1.5 report embedded carbon budgets and the net zero concepts in the climate discourse, both among policymakers and among scientists. So if we could move the slide on one please. Graphs like this one, if it appears on the screen, could we move the slides, please? Have helped define the wider debate. And informed the technical dialogue that formed part of the first global stocktake process under the Paris Agreement. I don't know if it's possible to move the slides on at this point. Otherwise, I'll just have to, yeah, thanks. But as well as being under the sun, the integrated assessment community has also been in the spotlight. The integrated assessment modelling section was one of the trickiest and lengthiest when it came to approving the Working Group 3 summary for policymakers last year. And the same challenges that emerged in approval have resurfaced in a recent UNFCCC document, which synthesises government views on the consideration of outputs from the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. Now, if we could move the slide on now, because it's quite important for what I'm going to say. So look at this section on the best available science from the stocktake document, and look carefully at the diplomatic language. Most governments, and therefore by implication not all, thought that IPCC 6th assessment was either a significant source of scientific knowledge or the most comprehensive and best available science to date. So some people were not agreeing with that. The next paragraph flags the caveats that at least some governments want to place on the science assessed by IPCC, with particular concerns about the treatment of equity, justice, and income distribution. And I have to emphasize, they're not referring to climate science as a whole. These are specific references to integrated assessment modelling output. So at the start of the new cycle, the integrated assessment modelling community and IPCC face some challenges. If the work of the community is to remain policy relevant, the community itself needs to be flexible and move on a bit, or else the sun might move on and shine on other parts of the scientific community. Now, tomorrow, we're going to be holding the first Bureau meeting of the IPCC 7th cycle. And options for the programme of work in the 7th cycle is the biggest item on the agenda. The output of the Bureau meeting is going to be carried forward to the first panel meeting in January, which will decide what reports are going to be produced during this decade. And based on a cursory look at views expressed by governments, my personal prediction, and it is a personal prediction, is that we will go ahead and produce the 3 working group reports and a synthesis report. There will certainly be a special report on climate change in cities, and plans for a scoping meeting are already underway. And there will be at least one other report or product, such as a technical paper. Now, governments have already tossed in some ideas, but I have to say that the centre of gravity of these suggestions is around aspects of the physical science of climate change, including tipping points, as well as impacts and adaptation. And that goes along with a general desire to focus on the decade of action, and now that climate change is unambiguously on us, more near-term perspectives. So how does the IEM community need to act to maximise its policy relevance? And if we could move the slide on just once more to the last slide. Here are the recommendations of an IPCC workshop on the use of scenarios in the 6th cycle and subsequent assessments, which took place in April 2023, and I think are highly relevant for this meeting. And I've no doubt, I know there's a poster somewhere in the session on that. Now, there were 25 recommendations in all for different groups, including modelers, research funders, and IPCC itself. But here's my personal selection of the most relevant. First, modelling depends on background scenario assumptions. and a wider range of background scenarios need to be considered, not just shared socioeconomic pathway 2, which dominated AR6, and perhaps not even the current SSPs, which arguably don't reflect all the concerns expressed by governments about attention to equity and justice. And following from that, there's the need to build capacity and increase the diversity of the research community and the modelling centres. And as you say, I think very much welcome the progress that IEMC is making in America. So a little bit of work to be done for the longer term. And finally, at the boundary between IPCC and the research community, I think there's a need in the last two things at the bottom to make scenario screening more transparent, subject to peer review, consider how ensembles of scenarios are assessed, and move beyond the treatment of scenario sets as statistical distributions, which for various reasons that they are realistically not. And I might add, from an IPCC perspective, I think we need to get a clearer articulation of where research stops and assessment starts. We need to look at the boundary between IPCC and the research community. So these are the challenges I've got for the future. I think the IEM community has enjoyed unparalleled success during the last IPCC cycle. And I sincerely hope that we can work together to make sure that that success continues in AR7. But with that, I think I'd like to pass on to Kate Calvin, who, along with our fellow co-chair, Joy Pereira, is really in the driving seat. I'm in the honorific position now. All the difficult work happens through the Working Group 3 co-chairs. So over to you, Kate.
It's on? Okay, great. Yeah, so we still have the opportunity for about 8 minutes of questions. And so from the room, other people that would like to ask questions to Jim and Kate. If you do, please come to the front and use the microphone.
Hi. Thank you for your interesting views on especially the scenario workshop outcomes. You started off with the city, so what in your view is the role of integrated assessment models in terms of modeling mitigation scenarios for cities, and how can we use that to inform policymakers?
Kate or Jim? The question, did you hear the question? The question was especially what role we can play in the special report for urban areas or cities.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can go first. I mean, we're going to make very, very fast progress with the special report on climate change in cities. And my suspicion is that we will be able to use the scenarios, for example, things like the illustrative mitigation pathways that were already developed for AR6 would be used within the cities report. The cities report will cover both adaptation and mitigation, so it's important that it has high-end emission scenarios in there, but also those that are ambitious and compatible with Paris Agreement goals. So, but there, I think the question is that there is a process running at the moment through Scenario MIP and CMIP to determine what will be the basic set of scenarios that could inform the 7th cycle as a whole. But these scenarios are likely to only come into play once we get onto the working group report. So I think it's a phased kind of process. I don't know if Kate wants to add to that.
Bob speaking from Potsdam Institute. Kate, hi Jim. Great to see you virtually. What a pity not to have you with us, but I see the urgency for you to be in Geneva. And my question is towards the integration part. I mean, there's a lot of need of integration across the working groups and so on. What's about IPBES in the scenarios out there? There was this kind of expert working meeting 2 years ago, I think, between IPCC and BES. Are there any discussions going on to integrate their nature futures visions? They base their scenarios on the SSPs, but are there any discussions planned or already started?
Will I go on that one, Kate? Yeah, I mean, just to say, obviously we took the first steps with IPBES, with that expert meeting that was just mentioned. Just to say, there are challenges in integrating with IPBES because there is no basis whatsoever under current IPCC procedures for actually producing jointly authored reports because of all sorts of difficulties about approval. So we have to do softer forms of collaboration. There were discussions among a group of people covering all UNEP assessments about whether we could develop a common scenario approach across assessments. And that is going a certain distance into the future. I think we can probably work quite successfully with the International Resources Panel, which very much looks to IPCC for its scenarios. But I think it's going to be more challenging for IPBES because they have actually taken decisions to have a set of 4 scenarios, which are really quite hard to reconcile with anything that you would want to do with IPCC, because they basically concern whether we look to biodiversity and ecosystem services for in their own right, or because they serve human needs. And this is a very difficult one to map onto the SSPs. So I think it's a space. I'm not optimistic about getting a common approach on scenarios, but there are other softer forms of collaboration that I think we can pursue during this cycle.
Jim, this is Roberto. Nice to see you. The issue I wanted to raise here, let's say, you both recognize, let's say, the central, let's say, importance that IAMs had during the AR6 cycle. But one problem we had at that time, let's say, because the different working groups run simultaneously, sometimes we had to run scenarios based on, let's say, assessment done in the previous cycle. And also, even in working group 3, let's say, there was an idea for IAMs play a much important role to be used by different chapters. But again, because all chapters have to run at the same time, sometimes, let's say, the scenarios we produce using IAMs are not fully used by the different chapters precisely because, let's say, we have to do everything at the same time. Any suggestion, any ideas, let's say, how to deal with that, let's say, because ideally, let's say, what the scenarios we're producing should be used by different working groups, but also by different chapters. Thank you.
I just add, this is just an intrinsic problem that IPCC has to deal with because we can't do the reports sequentially. Otherwise, the cycles would last 20 years, which nobody wants. I think the key thing is that there's already planning taking place under scenario MIP for a small set of scenarios that could be used by IPCC to help define the 7th cycle. And the starting point for that would need these scenarios, I think, unlike in the previous cycles, would be emissions driven rather than concentration driven. And it would be the case that the need would be for the integrated assessment modeling community to come up with a small set of scenarios that would help guide the cycle. And if these are in place quickly enough, I would be more optimistic, I think, about socializing the scenarios across the different chapters of a Working Group 3 report. But just to say, we've yet to scope any Working Group report at the moment. So there's no assumption yet about what the Working Group reports would actually look like and the role that sectoral chapters might or might not have. So I think watch this space.
Thank you. I think I would like to move to the next part, Bas, if that is okay with you. The last part of this session, we will be looking into the community scenario efforts. And I will first present something on the SSP updates and scenario MIP, which actually Jim was already talking about. And then Keywan RIAHI will say something about the challenges for our community and the new things going on. So if you could share my slides. It's the presentation that starts with community. Yes, great. There are two topics that I will address in my presentation. One is on the SSP updates and one is on scenario MIP. Now on the SSP updates, this is only one part of that story during this conference. There is also actually an SSP parallel session where we will also present some of the updates, and then there's the scientific working group and scenarios, and there we in depth are going to discuss some of these updates. The next slide is actually a slide that I already presented last year as well, and that's for the SSPs. Obviously we have different levels of ambitions of updating, and we can just update the historical data, and many of the IAM teams have done that over time. We can update the projections. Simply the projections were made now more than 10 years ago in a world that had different dynamics, and so there are new insights that could help us to update these projections. The third way to update the SSPs is also to think of the narratives. The SSP1 narrative on sustainable development might be different now, or the SSP3 narrative on a divided world. We might also want to rethink it a bit. And so that could be another level of ambition. And at some point, obviously, we also have to totally replace that framework. That framework was created with some purpose in mind, especially trying to link also the different working groups of IPCC. But maybe at some point a new framework works better, and so that needs to happen as well. And I think what we have decided is that we, for now, do that second level of ambition. So update the projections, and then after we have done that, start discussion on the other levels of ambition. Now for that, we actually have asked the teams that developed the original information for the demographic drivers, the economic drivers, and urbanization to work on updating their original projections. So it's exactly the same teams that have done this. And so the IIASA team has made new demographic projections. The OECD and the IIASA team have developed new GDP projections. And also we have asked the team that made the urbanization projections to update that as well. The data on the population and economic projections were released in the IIASA database before this summer, and we asked people to review that data. And we did get comments, and after the summer we discussed those comments and updated the projections, which led us now to the situation where we can say that the demographic projections are final. So they are published now as we speak in the IIASA database and can be used. And basically they lead to an increase in the number of people that we project. And that's simply because at some places we have a faster fertility decline. In several other places we have a slower fertility decline. And the total result is, for instance, that the SSP2 scenario is not peaking at somewhere between 9.4 and 9.7 billion, but at almost 10 billion. So that's a bit unfortunate news as well. But the new projections are higher in terms of urbanization, in population. For the GDP projections, the work that we had to do after the comments was a bit more substantial. And so what happened is now that an IIASA team in parallel made projections which are already available, but the OECD team is still working on it. That's the marker projections that we used last time, and will be the marker projection again. And they have promised us that the release will be before the end of this year, and the data will also be presented at the conference. Yeah, and obviously, especially the impact of COVID is, for instance, something that is accounted for in these new projections. For urbanization, the data is ready. Maybe an update is needed after the income projections have been released. And we are going to work also on a data set on poverty, which will be released summer 2024. And I'm now moving to the second topic, which is scenario MIP. And scenario MIP is this bridge between projections that are made by the integrated assessment models that are calculated using the large climate models and play a major role in the assessment of, first of all, working group 1 and subsequently also in working group 2. So starting that process, we had a meeting in Reading this year, and we had in total 80 people participating at that meeting. Many people from Earth system modeling, but also people from integrated assessment modeling, and discussing how should this new set of scenarios look like. And obviously there are specific needs for these scenarios. They need to link the different working groups. They have to be relevant for policy making, and they, for instance, they have to span the full range of possible climate change as well. Yes, so the scenario MIP needs to be relevant for AR7, but then there's also the stocktake process in 2028. And obviously it would be nice if the scenarios are available already at that time. That is not certain, and I will come back to that in a second, because that is really close by already. The timing of this process depends also on IPCC. As Jim already indicated, the timing for the different assessment reports needs to be still decided upon, and hopefully that might happen beginning next year. And when, for instance, the AR7 report is scheduled, has implications for this scenario MIP, because obviously the scenarios need to be available way before the new report comes out. The number of scenarios needs to be not too large, because Earth system model teams take a lot of time to run, but they need to be a sufficient amount from a policy perspective. They need to span the range of plausible scenarios, and what we have also decided is that we want them to be run in emission-driven mode. And just to explain that, last time we gave actually concentrations from the integrated assessment models to the Earth system models, and that's what they calculated. But that means that we are not using the full capacity of those Earth system models. They can also calculate the carbon cycle themselves, which gives much more uncertainty. And this time around, we would like to do a real good job in also representing that, which means that the projections will cover a much larger uncertainty range. So what did we decide? Which scenarios do we want to run? Now, first of all, one scenario that is in the middle, and that would be probably come out around 4.5 watts per square meter and would be representative of a potential world that is consistent with current policies. Then, obviously, we would like to have a high-end scenario, simply to explore what are the risks of climate change. We are convinced that this might be lower than RCP 8.5, simply because of reasons of the changes that happened in, for instance, expectations on coal use. But where it exactly comes out, we don't know yet. And so there is now a task force looking into this discussion. And then on the low end, we would like to have a set of scenarios relevant for Paris. One that might be relevant for 1.5, but that will be really something that needs to be explored. If these scenarios come out in 2028, the carbon budget of the 1.5 degree target will be very, very small. And so we're now exploring, is it still possible to make a credible scenario that comes out in the neighborhood of 1.5 with limited overshoot? If we do that, it probably means that we have to rely more on methane reductions. And so this scenario might have more lifestyle change, for instance, in diet than we had previously. Then we want to have one overshoot scenario that would follow a no action trend maybe until 2050 and then comes back. The question is, it needs to be different enough in terms of Earth system model runs, and so can we design something like that? And then we wanted to have a 2-degree scenario. Yeah, so we want to finalize this proposal by the beginning, so by spring next year. And there's also a timeline that we hope to achieve in terms of doing these runs. If we want to be relevant for the global stocktake, we have to finish this by mid-2027, preferably earlier. and that means that the IAM runs should actually be done ultimately by 2025. This is an extremely ambitious schedule. We will see whether this is possible, and it is also possible that we go for a different timeline that is more oriented towards 2028 or 2029, still being relevant for the AR7 report. But let's see what is possible. We're going to discuss this. This is what I wanted to share, and I would like now to hand over to Keywan RIAHI. And Keywan RIAHI is obviously from IIASA, and we'll be talking about challenges and opportunities and new topics in scenario analysis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Detlef. It's a real pleasure to be here and to see so many faces, many known faces, but also many faces, new faces in the conference today. And as Detlef already mentioned, what I would like to try to do, and I think we have 7 minutes or so left for these slides, to give you my personal view, perhaps, about emerging integrated assessment modeling research, building upon the experience in AR6, and I think what might be useful directions also to AR7. Actually, Jim and Kate both mentioned a number of topics that have been mentioned as well, but given the limited time, there were many topics that they mentioned, like a wider range of SSPs, regional and temporal, increase of regional and temporal resolutions, or for example, the community life database that I think would help us a lot in the future, that I will not talk about, but rather focus on a few selected topics. I'm doing something wrong. Oh no, that's. Yeah. So I think one of the key topics for moving forward is, of course, acknowledging the fact that if you look at the current assessment report, AR6, and if you look at the lowest scenarios that we find there, which basically describe a category of scenarios that manages to limit peak warming to 1.5 degrees with low or no overshoot, that there is increasing evidence because of emissions keeping quite high, and because of cumulative emissions that we can expect by 2025 and 2030. And even if we assume the most rapid possible emissions reductions to achieve net zero CO2 before 2050, if you compare that with updated evidence about the remaining carbon budget, it is very likely that those scenarios are getting out of reach, and that we are entering a new phase of thinking about how can we manage the overshoot, and think about what's the magnitude and duration of an overshoot of the targets, and what are the implications of overshooting the targets in terms of impacts and reversibility, which will depend on the magnitude and the duration of the overshoot, whether we reach tipping points by overshooting the targets, and also thinking about what does it mean for removing CO2 from the atmosphere again in order to drawing down emissions, about the sustainability of carbon dioxide removals, about different portfolios that might exist, and about the governance of overshoot. So I think this is something that will play an important role for AR7, and where the integrated assessment community, I think, has a lot to offer. And there are a number of projects actually also going exactly into that direction and try to understand this dimension. Related to that, I want to mention also the issue of feasibility. So very often integrated assessment scenarios are used because they show the order of magnitude of change and system changes that we need to introduce in order to achieve low targets. But very often the question arises, are those changes actually feasible? And if you look into the AR6, we have made already a first step into the direction of trying to assess in a more systematic way what is feasibility. And there are many different dimensions of feasibility, from geophysical, economic dimensions, technological, sociocultural, but also in soft factors like institutional and governance changes. And our models reflect some better and others worse. And if we look into basically the main confusion of AR6, actually governance and the institutional dimension and feasibility concerns that there are very rapid emissions reductions needed in developing countries has been one of the main feasibility concerns. So finding out a way how we as a community can better represent the heterogeneous situation of countries, and particularly institutional capacity and governance would be, I think, a great input into AR7. And also here the good news is that actually some of the projects start to, in a systematic way, look into governance and ways to improve governance. A first model intercomparison project is actually underway, which tries to assess what does it mean for the feasibility of staying below 1.5 degrees if we add those governance constraints into the models, but if you also look into enablers to basically remove some of the institutional and the governance barriers. And preliminary insights, for example, suggest that overshoot of 1.5 degrees increases, the risk of overshoot increases if you take the governance into account. That is the possibility, though, that countries with high institutional capacity can take more responsibility in the near term, and then important levers to basically reduce the overshoot risk or reduce the magnitude and duration of the overshoot of the targets would be to focus on demand side and electrification of service levels, for example, to mention some of those. But I think this is an area where insight would help a lot to also understand regional contributions of our global scenarios. Another topic that was mentioned earlier, particularly by Jim, and I think since the release of the AR6 there has been a lot of discussion about to which extent our scenarios include different dimensions of justice, or are we representing equity well enough, and I would argue we need to, in a much more explicit way, think about those implications. I think it's really important to acknowledge that actually justice and equity is beyond the economic considerations. So economic equity is just one dimension of many, and there is actually a new justice framework developed by Caroline Zimmer and colleagues, which would just appear, I think, next week in Nature Climate Change, not sure, which tries to make a first step into this direction and basically provide a framework how to design and to evaluate, for example, scenarios from different justice dimensions and perceptions, and how different patterns of justice could be brought into the integrated assessment modeling. This is not only about the methodology, but this is also about the scenario development process and procedures that need to be inclusive in order that scenarios are basically seen as more just. Two additional topics that I want to emphasize. One is increasing the scope of our scenarios. Lots of our studies are going beyond the climate mitigation perspective and include also other societal objectives, particularly the SDGs. And at the other hand, mitigation is happening in an increasingly changing climate, so we need to integrate other objectives, the SDGs, together with mitigation and adaptation. And there's a lot of work, I think, to do for us to better bring in the impacts component and the SDGs in a more comprehensive way into our scenarios. I give you, for example, I would say one very prominent example that has tried that is the paper by Zörgle et al. On the left-hand side, but there are also projects which try to explicitly combine or integrate mitigation with adaptation and impacts, just such as the Navigate project. A challenge. Yeah, and one way to get there is, of course, to provide much more granular information to the community that can be used in order to better represent some of these dimensions where you need to know distributional effects much better, and also the granularity of social and as well as economic information. Therefore, I would like to point you to an activity which is the so-called SSP Extension Explorer, which tries to facilitate and bring all those different informations on the distributional side of the SSPs together, and basically help to better represent, for example, distributions which are important for adaptation. So a lot of information which is adaptation relevant and might help us to perhaps go the next step in the integrated assessment community to include adaptations into the scenarios, adaptation and including the limits of adaptation and dependent on different determinants of the adaptation capacity. In this database, which is spearheaded by Marina Andrejevic, we have also further information actually to include different alternative governance perspectives and increase the resource for the community to include basically those dimensions. And this is where I want to stop. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we do have another 5 minutes for questions also regarding these last two presentations. Yeah, Volker?
Yeah, thanks for the interesting presentations. I have one directed to you, Detlef, and specifically about the timeline in the scenario MIP process, which you rightly pointed out seems very challenging if we look back how long the RCP and the first SSP process took. At the same time, you were mentioning that there is still discussion whether this timeline is actually relevant or whether to go for a kind of more relaxed one towards 2028 or 29. To me, it seems it's super urgent to get a decision on that, because if the stringent timeline holds, I think we need to know this now to be able to work towards that. And of course, nobody is starting in the green field, but has existing project work and so going on. So yeah, would appreciate if you could comment by when the final decision on this is to be expected.
Yes, now there were a few elements that would influence that decision. So first of all, the timeline of IPCC. As Jim indicated, and I don't know whether Jim and Kate are still online, but the IPCC has a plenary in January, and at least some ideas will be decided at that time, which helps us to also plan scenario MIP in the most optimal way. The second is the design of scenario MIP. So we're now looking into this on the low side, which scenarios we would like to have on the high side. That discussion, we hope to publish a first idea by the end of November. And so the last element in that decision is actually where are the Earth system modeling teams now in terms of updating their models. So that we didn't ask them yet, but that is the third element that we need to do. And then with that information, we could lay down the puzzle and then realistically say, this is something that we can do or cannot do. And so that would be early next year.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. This question is for you. I would like to know in the SSP, the update, is there an element, because you said there's a new element of poverty, yeah? So is there an element that captures mass death? If there is poverty, is there an element that captures mass death or mass migration due to climate?
Not yet. And I think that's a very good question, is how do we incorporate climate change actually in our own projections? Because if we are serious that climate change is an important thing, then you would expect our population projections, our economic projections, our migration projections also to take that into account. when we originally made the SSPs, we decided not to account for that, to avoid circularity. We make these scenarios, we give them to Working Group 2. Working Group 2 is also using them to make their assessments of impacts. And so if we already accounted for the impacts, it becomes a bit more difficult and we thought, okay, it's probably simpler not to do it. We have decided this time to still remain in that frame, but it becomes increasingly problematic. And so I'm quite sure that after we have finished this, we will see whether we can also make a set where we might want to take climate impacts into account as well, and provide that as a second set for people that could be used. But obviously that second set is even more uncertain than the first set. If you want to add, okay. Any more questions? Yep, please come to the front. Yeah, I was already referring to the Olympics as a reference.
I'm Shinjiro Fujimori from Kyoto University. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions to Detlef. So one is about the lower end scenarios, and is there any discussions on whether we should limit the lower boundary as 1.5, or would it be possible to think about more further lower potentials? Because we have already seen some literature that addresses about the such kind of ranges, and also we also have such study now, and so that's one. The second one is more procedure side, and here today you show 4 or 5 scenarios as a scenario MIP exercise, but in the previous CMIP6 there would be tier 1 to levels, and maybe around 10 scenarios or so were considered. And are you simultaneously considering such larger number of scenarios to provide to scenario MIP communities? And I think if you do so, then there'll be more considerations like variations in air pollution, land use pathways, as well as, as you indicated, methane emission would be one of the really interesting topic for air chem MIP folks. But yeah, would like to know that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So on the first question was on the low scenario. Does it has to be constrained to 1.5 at the end of the century? Couldn't be lower. And so we are now discussing that actually, and it's one option that most likely the very low scenario will not peak much lower than 1.6, maybe slightly higher, or at least around that level. And then after that it goes down. How much it goes down depends on our estimate of the realistic level of CDR. And so in describing that scenario, we would like the integrated assessment modeling teams at some point to submit potential candidates and then decide which of those candidates we would find the most interesting to run. And whether that scenario then ends up at 1.5, 1.4, 1.3 in that area, we still have to decide. On the second question, there was, I presented 5 scenarios, and previously there were also tiers. So the first element there is that scenario MIP will again work together with AirChem MIP, with land use MIP, to make variations on the main scenarios with specific different assumptions for aerosols and land use, to specifically look into the impact of those. So that will be done. We have to think of interesting consequences of our design as well. I think you yourself are part of a paper where we're pointing out that RCP 7.0 has this interesting aspect that because it is so high on aerosol emissions, it has a different precipitation pattern than other scenarios. And if we decide that RCP 8.5 is not relevant anymore, all of a sudden this becomes relevant. We have to think of such consequences of our design as well now. So I think it's a good point, and we have to, we will be collaborating with ACAMIP and NUMIP to address this. Anything you would like to add?
One thing perhaps,
Yeah, go ahead.
So perhaps adding to what Detlef said on the low end scenario and how low you want to go. So one thing that we explicitly discussed in the group was that this very low scenario, you want to make it, at the one hand, plausible, and but with a strong push to the system. But you want to make sure, in terms of the CDR levels, that these are sustainable CDR levels, that they take actually the link, for example, to food security and biodiversity into account. So that might be also then give you the low level in terms of temperature, because there's a clear, as you know, there's a clear trade-off between how low you can go and other objectives on land.
Okay, I think by now we would like to close this session. We run 10 minutes over, but that actually has a reason. In the next session can be a little bit shorter than originally planned. I don't know whether Jim and Kate, whether you're still online. If so, can I ask the technical assistants to still bring them up? But maybe they already left us.
I am still here. I don't know about Jim.
Okay, because I forgot to also thank you at the end of the previous session. I think it would be helpful if we still have a round of applause for Jim and Kate for joining us.